Good afternoon. Thanks for joining Live with Lisa, now live on YouTube. And we are thrilled today to have Sarah Plummer Taylor. Sarah and I have known each other for a long time. She is a U.S. Marine veteran. You were deployed to Iraq twice. She is the author of Just Roll With It, 7 Battle-Tested Truths for Building a Resilient Life. And oh gosh, while you were a Marine, you captained and played in the U.S. Military Olympic women's soccer team from 2007 to 2011. There are so many things. I'm looking at this list of things I'm reading off here. And when we started working together, you had just branded the Semper Sarah brand and website, and you were coaching people through challenges and helping them unstick themselves from the challenges that they were having. And one of the projects that you and I worked on together was Senator Gillibrand's Military Justice Improvement Act, which we worked on when you were interviewed on Katie Couric. And on our website, we posted a blog about when you gave a speech with the US senators on why justice in the military was so important. And well, Sarah, thank you for being here today. I know that you have a lot going on. You're about, what, 4 minutes from having your second baby. And
on the cusp.
and you were willing to be on today, and so thank you. You know, a lot of accolades there, and now you have a book coming out in September, also Stopping Military Suicides, that you've co-authored with Kate Hendricks Thomas. Talk to us about, where should we start? When you were in the military, you were a Marine, and should we start there? And you saw a lot, you experienced a lot, you have fellow veterans who have had challenges, and you were compelled to help.
Yeah. So, much of what I've developed professionally over the last decade plus was informed by early personal experiences with my Marine Corps career, beginning in ROTC and then through my time active duty and as a reservist. And for me, a very specific experience I had in regards to the military judicial system was around actually a couple different experiences I had with sexual assault and harassment during my time in the Marines. And but what that opened my eyes to were larger injustices just across the board, and then getting more specifically into mental health support. Again, not only around those types of traumas, but really anything along the spectrum of stress injury or trauma with a big T or little t, as we often say, that a lot of veterans, even still in this modern generation, are feeling very left behind by the mental and behavioral health support that's available, not available, hard to get to, told it's available, but still, I mean, there's just a lot of confusing and kind of inconsistent support out there, even as much support as there is. And to me, that's the more, in some ways, more pressing injustice, just because it impacts so many, the veterans and their families as they're trying to transition into civilian life.
So is that something that's driven by, and I certainly don't want to get into a political discussion as much as, is that driven by administration, or how do we support our veterans, and why is it confusing?
Yeah, I mean, it's multi-layered, of course. I mean, some of it is just the cultural setting and what are cultural norms in a military community that have existed for much longer than some of the modern applications, even, for instance, what we can do with technology, with telemental health and other forms of telehealth that are available now. Even, being able to, let's say, broaden the scope of clinical providers that are available to veterans. Only relatively recently have veterans been able to really use telemental health if they live in, let's say, a rural area, or can't find a provider within a reasonable amount of time at their local VA, that availability is broadening, but sometimes it's still even hard to get that approved, even if a larger policy supposedly changes it. So we've had the Community Care Act and the CARES Act, and the names have changed even over the last 5 to 10 years of, again, supposed to be widening that window of availability for veterans and their families. And in the gap, a lot of private institutions have popped up to try to help. And even within that, there can be a plus and a minus to it, that the stuff, the support is available, but sometimes it can make it hard for the individual veteran to sort through or find what is available, because the VA just isn't a one-stop shop, especially when it comes to mental health. They're sort of, at max, most are at max capacity as they are. So a lot of other veteran service organizations and private institutions are trying to fill that gap.
Do you think that with COVID, now that so much is being done on video and so many more appointments are being done on video, that that's something that might help in the future with that?
Gosh, I hope so. I mean, you would think, right? you would think that through this experience of now months of it, and really all things considered, a universal experience. This isn't like, oh, only the veteran community is facing this challenge, but like for everybody to be in one way or another in this boat together. That we could see, hey, this telehealth capacity is hugely supportive, and hopefully that makes the lines of approval. And I mean, that's kind of the, very broadly speaking, one of the major barriers to receiving care through the VA. One of them is just kind of the red tape, basically, that you have to go through. It isn't just like, oh, well, I have VA insurance, and we have the Community Cares Act, so I can just find a provider and get it. I mean, I'll say personally, even I've spent months trying to just get a new mental health counselor here in North Carolina. We moved from Colorado to North Carolina, and I've gone round and round and round through a system that I'm like, it's supposed to work, fluidly. I'm a well-adjusted, relatively intelligent human being. I feel confident I can navigate a system, and it becomes very time-consuming and frustrating very quickly a lot of times. So that can be a huge barrier to receiving care in a formal sense.
Sure. I think of the military, and I was thrilled that this whole week on Live with Lisa is dedicated to our military veterans. And, it being Memorial Day, I thought it would be the perfect week to do that. And then, and with that, I have so much appreciation and respect for the military. And there's so much what I think of as honor and duty and all of these great things. Why is it then that veterans aren't getting the support that they need, do you think? And what, from maybe a trend standpoint, what are the most common things that people are not being helped with?
Well, kind of sticking within the mental health, behavioral health bubble, broadly speaking, I would say one is, again, that cultural piece that's still on active duty, with as much as things have changed.
Mm-hmm.
Granted, I left active duty about 10 years ago, but still have friends who are serving, and, kind of hearing from them and other sources, what sort of evolutions are happening in the cultural setting of the military. But I mean, I think there's still just very much so like pain is weakness leaving the body kind of mentality, and suck it up, buttercup, and all those sort of things that we joke about, but we joke because it's actually true. There's still just a huge barrier to care seeking because veterans don't take kindly to a patient identity. It implies that you're broken, that you're not strong. And so really, even through the work that I, and with the book, specifically with Stopping Military Suicides, with my co-author, Dr. Kate Hendricks Thomas, who's also a Marine veteran, mm-hmm. is we're trying to take this upstream approach, right? Proactively, what could be done that is culturally palatable to a service member, what could be offered while they're active duty to start to build in the cultural acceptance of like, hey, this is definitely not about being weak. It's actually about becoming stronger and being more dynamic, more creative, more resilient, that as that is woven in active duty, that will impact, courses of care when they become veterans. But at this point, even saying, okay, well, let's talk about veterans specifically. Where are we right now? Like, how do we again, reach out to veterans without calling them patients or broken, or using, honestly, kind of our Western medical model that's very linear. And healing is not linear, especially when we're talking mental health and behavioral health. It's very up and down, 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing. And that's really hard for a military mindset, often a Western medical mindset, to not see it as like, how do I get from point A to point B?
Right.
When all this other stuff is going to happen in between, which is more realistic.
One of our our attendees in the chat said, imagine if someone like you has a challenge working the system to find a service provider, how many others are unable to access the services they need? And I think of that, you're one of the most highly capable people I've met, and to think that you're having that challenge. Do you think that starts when they're still in active duty then? Because of course, when we worked on the Military Justice Improvement Act, part of that was that, you know, the judicial system started and stopped with the commanding officer. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, in essence, yeah, that was one of the major barriers to justice, was saying it's all very internalized and personal, and yeah, that military units are like families. So how do you get impartial justice offered in situations like that?
But if, and I'm throwing this out there, if a commanding officer appreciated the mental health needs more, maybe would that be something that maybe they would then encourage, or
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and that's where you can have sort of, you know, big picture, like military culture, and then you have your larger unit, smaller unit, you get down in the small unit level. And that's definitely where individual commanders, even just officers in charge, kind of at that, again, even lower unit level, can definitely make a huge impact. I mean, I know, again, friends of mine who are still serving now who definitely understand, appreciate, and value, you know, big concept, but resilience, and understand how to proactively kind of integrate it into some of their training, are still getting pushback from people who don't. So, you know, they're working within their small unit and their small, basically, scope of practice. But I think that's a lot of responsibility to put on individuals when, especially, so much of this resilience building work is empirically validated. And again, that's something else that Kate and I integrate into the book, I believe, really well. Like, to say these aren't just like, hey, feel good, you know, fun ideas to like not want to kill yourself. I mean, I'd say that flippantly because sometimes that's how it comes across. Like, you know, just hang out with your friends and do these things and you'll feel better. It's really, it is scientifically based. It's empirically validated. It's been well studied and researched. And so integrating that background with personal story, with the cultural component and the social component, sort of the social proof from veterans who've deployed and who have lost friends and faced personal challenges, to say, this is how, it's not a catch-all, a cure-all, but this stuff can work, and here's how.
So let's go back to your first book, because when we first met, you had this great talk about becoming unstuck, right? And that people get stuck in something and they need to, you know, unstick themselves, which again, maybe doesn't sound as scientific, but it's, you know, your expression. And certainly, again, you've been to war, or, you know, is that the way you would say it? Again, I'm not sure if I just said that right.
Sure. I mean, I would say I've deployed to combat zones.
Okay. All right. And then also, but you've had things happen, like you were hit by lightning when you were running, and, you know, all sorts of things that could have set you back. And you wrote the book because you identified ways that people could first help themselves. You also were someone who told me very on that I should be doing yoga to help me calm myself. And so, you know, talk about some of those things that people can do that maybe isn't so much modern medicine, but really self-care, and it translates into all of your research now.
Yeah. So a couple things I would clarify on the front end, like using the term self-care. That's another one of those things that you can say it, and if you say it to 5 people, they're all going to have 5 different ideas or impressions of what that means. And so not only in my book, Just Roll With It, that came out, gosh, now 5 years ago, but even more so in the one coming out this year, in Stopping Military Suicides. What we mean by self-care is nervous system regulation. Like, that is like baseline, upfront, number one, what we mean with self-care. Now, there's a time and a place for sure for things like, you know, late night movie watching and eating your favorite foods till you get sick to your stomach or whatever, you know, but that's more self-comfort. So when we say self-care, we mean, how do we regulate a fried nervous system? And whether that's fried due to prolonged stress, to, again, that either big trauma or lots of little traumas, all of that put together, just modern life and how our biorhythms are thrown out of whack and kind of poked all the time to be in stress mode, it's very hard to access any of the other things we might encourage you to do that fall in the behavioral health realm, whether that's around food choices, exercise choices, professional, whether that's, hey, do some yoga. Like if your system is in a fight, flight, or freeze mode, or just a terrified mode, and I'm not even talking about what you think about, but what your body is processing, you're not going to want to go to a yoga class, next to 20 other sweaty people 2 inches away from you, right? So you can't tell in this case, a veteran who has stress injury or has experienced trauma, come on, just go do some yoga. Like, I don't want to go in a crowded room and deal with all that, right? Until you can access some form of self-regulation. Even the social support can really feel off limits. Again, you're not necessarily going to want to reach out to family and friends because you just feel like you're on the edge all the time, right? So having a conversation even with your close friends can feel increasingly difficult. And then you begin to isolate. And so all these kind of symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress and stress injury, the cruel irony is they often prevent us from accessing the healing we need. So in many ways, starting with that nervous system regulation, as we describe self-care, really can feel like the starting point to getting to any of the other stuff. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of a contraction right now. To accessing the self-care, spiritual practice and social support, all going together. Yeah.
Yeah. You okay?
I am.
Okay.
I'll just catch my breath for a second.
The good thing is that we're only 25 minutes. And so, but I'm so thankful that you're on today because this is so important. It's such an important week where I think that people that need to be recognized need to be recognized. And you just used a term that I had not used. I knew fight or flight, but you said fight, flight, or freeze. And I hadn't thought about that way before, that, sometimes with anxiety, you're just frozen.
Yeah.
And so again, that's what you're referencing, is that they're frozen, they isolate, and then they're not doing what it is that they need to do. What do you suggest to the people that are around them? How can they help them?
Well, obviously it's going to differ based on the person and in the scenario, where I think a lot of times those moments happen when people are alone, whether that's at home or work or, in your car, let's say, where you just are like, you just sit there and, like, whether you consciously realize it or not, you freeze, right? You freeze either intentionally or unintentionally. Sometimes people dissociate and feel like they left the room, right? I feel like I left the building or I left my body. Right. So I know that I froze or had a sense of like I lost time or something like that. But, so I do have some experience as a clinician with my master's in social work and kind of practicing in that more formal counseling background. But I'll just say, through both the books, and again, especially through Stopping Military Suicide, we talk less about kind of those acute moments and more of like, what are we building into the day to day as we can. And so I want to make sure I try to answer your question as far as, if you are, around other people, friends or family, what have you, what they should do is, I think, try to, at a base level, understand and be patient and give them time. And I think less of the poking and prodding that sometimes happens, like, come on, what's going on? Or kind of the snap out of it, that even can be well-intentioned, but that people can sometimes say, like, or get over it, or what's your problem? Like, those kind of direct confrontations is that aren't helpful, because the brain and the body are literally trying to catch up, right? They're trying to get back online. So, whether you've had a head injury in that, and for a lot of people who've had traumatic brain injuries and concussions, it's that feeling of brain fog almost, right? Like I gotta, it's like, there we go. Then it gets online, right? And you're kind of waiting for that circuit to connect. And in some ways, in a very basic level, that's what's happening, right? It's our circuitry needs to be rewired. And so the more that we practice mindfulness-based practices outside of those acute moments, over time, it becomes relatively easier to access that even in the acute moments. But in many ways, it's more about what we're doing, again, in that almost upstream, proactive kind of model beforehand, that for many people, it then lessens either the intensity or the time of those offline moments or fight, flight, or freeze moments.
Right.
I just want to caveat it that I'm not saying like, oh, do yoga every day and you'll never have those moments again. That's not what I'm saying at all. And that there are lots of ways to practice mindfulness that are not yoga and meditation as well.
Sure. You had mentioned a few of them. It was spiritual practice, self-care, and social
support.
Social support.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And when you talk about spiritual too, you're saying this is spiritual, doesn't need to be religious. Someone, again, you don't want someone to shut off and say, no, I'm not religious.
Right.
About that.
So it's really more about like a sense of purpose or meaning making that you have access to in your life in a way that, again, is a practice. So much of what we're researching and then suggesting from a programmatic or in cultural standpoint to our fellow veterans is, what are these things that you can do day in or day out, regardless of your background, your setting, like what can you access? We have these broad categories of self-care, social support, and spiritual practice, but within that, you can absolutely personalize it in a way that makes sense to you, right? So for some people, yoga is like, makes them batty, and when they swim, they feel like they're in the flow, right? Or in that almost meditative state, or when people are out in the woods or on the trails.
Or on their motorcycle.
Yeah.
Flying
right. So
or something, that.
Well, it's like one of the things I tell people is, like in a yoga class, even if I say, okay, focus on the breath, I don't mean focus like, there's my breath. It's like focus when you're reading your favorite book or listening to your favorite music, eating one of your favorite foods. And it's kind of a soft focus, right? Like things can be going on around you and you may not notice it. You're just like, I'm having a relationship with this brownie right now. Like whatever, like whatever the thing is that you're just like loving it.
Right.
And you're present, right? You're mindful with that experience and you're tasting the food and noticing the texture and things like that. So with spirituality, I recommend Viktor Frankl's book. And I want to make sure I say the title right. It's over there on my bookshelf, or is it? But it's about his experience in a concentration camp and what and he was basically a clinical psychologist before the war began. And so, I mean, that's the lens through which he was seeing his experience, but really talking about how even in, I think what most people would acknowledge is one of the most dire of circumstances, noticing the difference between the people who made meaning of the situation and those who didn't, and basically how much healthier those people were, again, even in this terrible situation, and those who survived and thrived had some kind of connection to purpose and meaning, even in these just incredibly challenging times. And so taking that forward into less extreme, or for some people, extreme combat situations or refugees and, all the things that people are experiencing around the world, being able to see some sort of meaning in it, and translating it kind of into something bigger than yourself is what we mean by spirituality, spiritual practice.
Well, and what you've been able to do with everything that you've worked on, whether it's, coaching people or military justice, and now people who, we're concerned about from a suicide standpoint, you've done this, I don't even want to say full circle. You've just continued to expand your empathy for others and understand that you have this power to make a change and to impact people. And where do you think that comes from? It's really remarkable.
Well, for me, faith is a big part of my life. And, so their faith for me is a word that fits within the broad umbrella of spirituality. And it's changed for me, that definition of it and how I practice, but always there's been some, even as a child, kind of searching and seeking for meaning making. And, part of it is I was raised in a military family. We moved a lot. You find your ways to kind of make sense of those things that can feel very disruptive as a kiddo. Yeah. And then being in competitive environments with sports and schools and things like that. Just feeling like I had a sense of connecting to something bigger than myself, and then also being, in a very practical sense, being in communities and team settings where I saw what a positive difference that made, even when things, were awful or hard. If I had teammates, if I had, Marines and my mates in my unit and things like that, like what a big difference that made. And so, combo of that faith and then the social support and staying connected in that way, have just, in one way or another, whether I was consciously choosing it or not, 20 years ago, has always been a part of my life.
I remember when you were giving that speech in DC, and you said that there were things that you felt unfair, and your mother said, you can't change the military. And you said, I'm here today because we can change the military. And you really have always fought for things to be better for the people who serve. And I have to believe that you're growing up in a military family. Your parents were in the Air Force, right?
Mm-hmm. My dad was, yep.
Okay. And that you probably have a different level of empathy for people, just having that been your whole life.
Yeah, I think between that and then even through, sports was such a huge component of my life. And, when you're on teams and you get to know people and you just hear, like, beyond knowing people as teammates, but like knowing what's going on in their lives. And I think especially for young women, like, realistically what the statistics show and then what the personal lived experience has shown of things that even, in middle school and high school, some of my friends and I were going through that can be defined as traumatic and tragic, and learning how to support your friends and yourself through those sort of events. And in some ways always felt like, to put it drastically, but honestly, like, it's life or death. Like, this is our life. Like, what are we doing? How do we do with the things that are happening to us? And not to just wholesale take on the, like, individualism bootstrapping thing that, like, that's part of it and that can be part of our self-care. But again, it was never without the social component. Like, we never succeed on our own, ever. What you and I did in DC, it was because we did it together. What we did, well, in New York with Katie Kirk, and then coming down to DC, and that whole thing, like, it would not have been the same if it had just been me. It would, pieces of it, because, my, work with the NJIA and whatever, but, like, it took on a whole new, and this too is a kind of a faith component for me. It took on something much bigger because we were doing it together than I could have ever done alone, and I think just seeing that over and over and over again in my life is continued to re-energize me when I get tired and feel like, oh man, am I making an impact, or how am I helping or not, to remember some of those moments for sure.
Well, I certainly appreciate that, because I've always said it was a highlight of my career.
Yeah, and, good couple of days.
It gives me chills to still watch that speech. For those who are watching, we reference it because Sarah had been invited to this press conference that Senator Gillibrand, Senator Shaheen were holding regarding the Military Justice Improvement Act, and we were invited as guests. And about 15 minutes before we came into Union Station on the train, and we were going straight over to the press conference, they called and said, would Sarah like to speak? And we looked at each other and wrote that speech in 15 minutes on the train. And so many people would say, I'm not prepared, I'm not ready. And we just went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And if, again, someone went to the blog on nickersoncos.com and looked at it, you just walked right up there and you opened that laptop, and you'd think you'd prepared for that your whole life. And in a way you did, right? You did prepare for that speech your whole life. And when the opportunity came, you just took it. And it was amazing. So, we're wrapping up here. And of course, you have something a little more important to go do. So again, someone said, she's coming on and she might be having a baby. And I said, she's a Marine. She can do anything. But I want to let you go. When that book comes out and people pick it up, what do you want them to know about it? Why is it so important that everybody reads it?
Yeah, well, a couple things. One, it is available for pre-order on Amazon already. Great. And even though the title makes it sound very, like, myopically focused on the military, Preventing Military Suicides. It is absolutely a book I can confidently say is good for anyone who's ever struggled with anything. And certainly if you've, I mean, that's so broad, but seriously, like if you're looking to build resilience, kind of build even peak performance, these, you know, the evidence of these approaches and the science behind it are very much also something that like I use when I am consulting in corporate environments to top executive teams to say, yes, these are some of these things have been discovered in clinical settings, but then as they've been applied across the board, they're used to enhance your life, period. Like, how can you be a better and more dynamic and creative and compassionate leader? How can you, you know, be a more dynamic creator, you know, depending on wherever you may be on the spectrum or the ladder within your work, there are applications for it professionally and personally. And I just wanted to make a quick segue, since I am due with my second child any moment here, that all this work that I have done primarily in the military and veteran setting the last 10 years has really prepped me for motherhood. And the proverbial trenches of motherhood, that although it's been honestly so much more fun and fulfilling than I ever thought it would be, has also kicked my butt and wiped the floor with me on more days than I can count as well. And I know that those blows have been softened because of, as much as possible, practicing what I preach. And so I would even say, like, hey, even for new mothers, like, don't be dissuaded by the book cover, like pick it up. This stuff can help when we're in those moments, and when we can take even just a couple minutes here and there every day to build some of that stuff, that resilient stuff up proactively. It can really, really help.
It may help people identify things they may not have seen too. I always think, my mother always said, everything's relative. So what feels one way for you could feel something to somebody else, and it's relative to how they feel. And so, you know, maybe if you read this book and you think maybe it's not for you, but you might be able to identify something in yourself or with others you may not have seen. So Sarah, I want to thank you for all of your work and all you're doing, and for being on today. I wish you the very best. I can't wait for an update later today or tomorrow.
Yeah. Or it could be a week or 2 weeks, who knows?
And for those of you who are loving these lunch webinars, and I'm so thankful for all the comments and emails that we get, we ask that you subscribe to Live with Lisa and share it with your friends. The subscribing will allow you to know all of the new guests that we have coming on, and we are here daily, Monday through Friday at 12:15 live every day. You can also find us on our new social media, Live with Lisa, on Facebook and Instagram. So thank you so much, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow. And Sarah, thanks so much, and we'll talk to you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Okay. All right. Bye.
Bye.